All right, so I guess just a little more background. So I'm an architect and urban planner, as well as professor in urban planning and comparative indigenous studies. I'm going to start with an introduction to kind of the focus of my research, in a way of mitigating the inevitable questions of that I am not an expert in all things housing, but kind of more thinking through the specifics of my approach and how it might be, or how I think it's valuable in considering the development of parcels such as those identified in the Vibrant Communities program as kind of new. I wouldn't say new, hence the title, learning from the past to inform the present, but maybe more innovative models for addressing the housing crisis. All right, so with that, all right, so to start off, my research really focuses on indigenous knowledge systems within the design and production of the built environment. And as we likely all know, especially if we think about the Ahapua system, they're very ingrained within a close relationship with the land, and that principle of aloha aina. And it comes from the land management system. So the Ahapua, or where my research has been focused, I guess we could have started with that. My research is focused in the Republic of the Marshall Islands, originally in response to the impacts of climate change, looking at climate adaptation and how indigenous knowledge systems can be lifted up in effective ways of mitigating vulnerability to disasters. So in the Marshals, the system that would correlate with the Ahapua is known as the Wado. And with that is similar concepts of identity, resource abundance, shared resources and economies. So I've kind of mapped it out more in a Kanaka Maoli fashion in this presentation. So thinking of Aina as Ahapua and a resource management system, the Mo'aina and Mo'okuaha of place, understanding our genealogies and the genealogies of place and how we learn from that to inform the present. And then our relationships with one another and responsibilities, and how that operates within a relationship to land and development. And within these kind of ethical frameworks, there's the concepts of abundance. So in the Marshals, there's the term Juan Kijek, which is one fire, one family. The idea that from the one fire, all the family or the clan are fed. And that brings a level of responsibility and connection to those resources that are being shared, which is, again, we have similarities kind of across Moana. And then the Kauhale being, so if we're looking specifically at housing as a potential model for thinking about addressing housing needs by going back and looking at how the Kauhale was effective in maintaining settlement within the Ahapua system, and working together as a form of both building capacity and supporting each other in development. So it's in a way that kind of idea of Laulima is not just, helping each other in, like, let's say the construction, like this diagram might show, but really thinking about how is the community-driven aspects of a project really at the heart of the entire process, right? 'Cause typically when we think about a community-driven project, it might only happen at certain touch points, maybe at the beginning and somewhat through the design, and then it's kind of left on its own, as opposed to thinking about how to fully integrate the community into the development of something like a housing project through various things like sharing, or not sharing, well, sharing, but hiring community members, ensuring percentages of products and materials are resourced locally, ensuring that local contractors and local consultants are utilized so that all the money stays within the community. So then just to briefly touch on so this is looking at land management practices in the Marshals, and hopefully some of you are familiar with how the Ahapua might look somewhat similar. Granted, it's not a high island. These are low atolls where you could throw a stone from one side to the other and not hit anything other than a coconut tree. But within the resource management, there's a really effective use of agroforestry in the production of food, and there's a close relationship between how settlement happens and the maintenance of those resources. So settlement happens on the coast because the coast provides various things like passive ventilation, proximity to the lagoon. It's an easier place to develop, and it protects the resources. And when we think, so looking at the settlement pattern on that kind of general, very quick glimpse of the resource management system is you have, similar to the Kauhale, you have many structures for sleeping, eating, hanging out, talk story, etc., located along the coast. And we still see these today, though we start seeing that influence of the continental mindset with more condensed dwelling within larger buildings, like typical tract home style. And the one argument that's a positive of something like the Kauhale is that because more of the dwelling happens outside, and we know that's part of cultural lifestyle, that you build a close relationship with the land and understanding of the place you inhabit, as opposed to when we move from that many small buildings to many walled, or many rooms within a single family home. There starts to become a bit of a detachment, and there's not going to be an environmental determinist. There's many reasons that happen. There's the market economy, more of your time spent working for someone else or some other corporation rather than for your family and your community. So you're not spending as much time on your living on the land, and also you're living more and more in single family homes where you're spending more time inside when you are at home, as opposed to living, dwelling more on the outside. Though looking at, so this is drawing from research with Marshals communities in Hawaiʻi, as well as in the continent in Arkansas and Oregon, is that, as much as we might assume that the many walled is the more common housing arrangement, we start to see that there's a movement back to the many small. And part of that's out of economic necessity. You can purchase a lot and slowly build housing units over time if it's relatively unregulated. But then obviously that hits a lot of walls when there's regulations that don't allow for that type of flexible build out. And so this is an example. I can't tell you where it's located for confidentiality, but it provides one example of how a clan, extended family, multiple generations, have managed to build a sense of community through incremental development over a period of about 15 years, developing many houses as well as lots of shared amenities like a meeting house and gardens and whatnot. So part of the research I'm conducting now is trying to understand what actual households need and what are their desires for spatial use, as opposed to just assuming, this desire of the typical 3-bedroom home. So that's the very quick gist of kind of my research, and we'll leave time for questions you can ask. Then just so briefly looking at the hapua, so this was the graphic, original illustration was by Marilyn Hahalawai. And then Sean Connolly kind of created this breakup to kind of explain how the Ahapua system works as far as land management. And we also, often hear that adage that, the traditional systems don't work in the contemporary modern world. But I think if we look at a lot of work that's being done in resource management, as well as rethinking urban planning, utilizing our indigenous systems, There actually is effective ways. So I'm most familiar with Sean Conley's work, in particular with the LOI Centennial. So if anyone's interested, you can check out loicentennial.org to learn more about that project. And here is just a brief look. And again, it's that learning from the past to inform the present and how we might rethink urbanism in a very dense area like Waikiki, and utilize the logics behind the Hapua system in order to mitigate the inevitable disasters, right, that the USACE, United States Army Corps of Engineers, has been working on for years. But so moving on, so that was just a quick lens at thinking of, you know, how do these systems, how might indigenous systems work in contemporary times? And this is another project done by, well, it was Taylor Cook Matia did this for their MArch thesis at Harvard GSD. And it's looking at, again, it's that same kind of movement from the many small to the many walled, how the Kauhale does get replicated in the new vernacular in Hawaii. If we're looking at homesteads or plantation style houses, kind of throughout the past century. And then just to kind of look at what happens here, and this is where I kind of wanted to bring up again that idea of living, you know, where the cultural lifestyle is living on the land, and there's a close relationship because in a way, the way the space is organized and utilized, both through protocol, cultural practice, as well as, again, just everyday lifestyle. But as that starts to be influenced as colonization occurs, and even more intensely through the US occupation, you start to lose the spatial, the component of living, you know, the dwellings being separate, living on the land, to really just living in a home. And I'd argue that, again, like I mentioned earlier, that transition into single family homes, as well as working in a market economy, starts to slowly detach our relationships to the land. And I think a large question that a lot of people are starting to look at now is how can we utilize these traditional systems to inform how we do things today, from one to see how many structures, so like a tiny home village, creates that a potential economic price point where one can enter into a housing market or just provide lower cost rents, but also to the point of integrating ecological aspects, so things like community gardens or shared resource maintenance within projects. And I think there's a lot we can learn within our own Pacific Island knowledge systems. So thinking about all the Pacific Islanders within our community that bring those systems with them. Like I mentioned with the Marshals bringing their own systems of agroforestry, as well as general kind of housing patterns that provide social safety nets. We also see that with Tongans. There's work done by Tavita Ka'ili on Maui, and how the Tongan community has similar systems that are helping with community development. So that's kind of that gives you kind of the theoretical academic grounding, and then looking at some examples and how this might be applied for the Vibrant Communities program. So one, you might be familiar with the Kauhale initiative, where they're starting to build out some of these tiny home villages on Oahu. Granted, these projects tend to be specifically targeted towards either a solution for houselessness or a solution for very specific segments of the population, like veteran housing or other segments. And if we look at them, though, they do provide that, like especially this nice rendering, provides a sense of that the community, community support. There's shared resources between community gardens, community centers, meeting rooms, etc. I'd imagine some would probably have childcares within them and whatnot. And you start to have, this idea of it, trying to regain that attachment to the place. Granted, something like this only works in certain parts of our urban to rural transect, and wouldn't necessarily work in like downtown Hilo. So then to look at a specific parcel, and this was one that Janice suggested, I'm just going to look at kind of basics of what we know we can do, and then what is possible, trying to think through application of these models. So this is a parcel. I have the TMK number, not that that's going to help anyone. I forgot to get the address, but it's so this is county-owned property at the intersection of Kauailani and Kuhilani, and there's a general map. I don't know how small it is on your screen. You can kind of see the red dot is a lot location, and then a little bit of zoomed in. So we see, I think what's interesting in this lot, so this is zoned residential 15, so minimum lot size 15,000 square feet. It's a 1.3 acre lot, or 64,687 square feet. We see a decent fine grain, so smaller lot size with housing adjacent. And partially that's because those are Department of Hawaiian Homelands properties that have different regulations than this lot would. But we start to imagine, maybe there's possibilities where what's developed there replicates what's around it. But at the kind of base level of what the code allows is, outright, you can do a single family home with an ohana dwelling. And then there would need to be space for a turnaround for a fire access. And then on the left side in this slide is what you could do, again, outright, but you'd have to put in a permit for subdividing the lot into the allowable lot size, which is a minimum width, and for the size of this lot, the minimum width for the subdivision would be 90 feet, and the minimum size 15,000 square feet. So what you end up doing is the best you can get is 3 16,400 square foot lots. And this is not, I was doing this very quickly, so it's not going to meet the code currently as it's drawn. But again, like the need for a turning radius in some format, and then drive aisle access to each of the dwellings. But with 3 lots, you all of a sudden go from having the ability of 2 dwelling units to 6 dwelling units. And then on the right side is thinking, well, what if you had a more flexible regulation, a more flexible land use allowment for this site? Then you can start thinking more innovatively, not unlike the Kauhali initiative and other projects, other cottage village or tiny home developments. And you can envision it becoming more of a community based development where you have shared resources, whether it's, access to like a community space for maybe it's Wi-Fi connectivity for online classes, or it's a meeting space. Maybe it's a space where you can have like trainings for emergency preparedness or CPR or whatnot, and space for communal gardens, shared barbecue areas, shared emu, etc. Again, this is just a super rough drawing, but hopefully it starts to bring some imagination into what might be possible. So what I want to introduce is 2 ways of going about this. So again, I think a really important part is not just thinking about how do we provide housing, but how do we provide housing that reconnects us to the land and have a responsibility for the land that is going to provide or build more sustainable communities, as well as, help the county with land management. Might be a bigger task. Couple projects. This is one I'm currently working on. So there's one project that's in the Marshall Islands, and yes, there's completely different regulations, so it's not an issue. But there's a new project where an individual in Hawaii County asked about, because they had seen this and were interested in doing something similar. So we're investigating, and this falls within the normal frame. It's three structures. One would technically be an ohana dwelling or guest house. The other is would be considered an accessory building. But what we're doing is breaking apart the conventional American home, single-family home, and thinking about how to best utilize shared resources, and again, have this movement to living more outdoors than spending your entire time indoors, or most of your time indoors. So in essence, the larger structure in this image is the sleeping area with a covered living space. But then the kitchen, the wet spaces, the kitchen and the bathrooms are actually separated so that they can be shared with a second unit. So it increases, it reduces the cost of the more expensive spaces to build. Granted, there's separate unit, or they're separate accessory buildings, which tends to add some cost, but there is benefit given the materials we can use in order to reduce some of the costs, as well as, again, it's being shared between multiple families. And then another example, and this is not in Hawaii, but it gives an essence of perhaps a possibility. Again, the density level is a question of where you are in that spectrum of rural to urban. And perhaps for this site, the parcel I was showing earlier wouldn't work. So this project is on a 2-acre lot with a tribe here in Bellingham looking at, and this is a project for permanent supportive housing for houseless individuals. So it is, again, in that kind of where we typically see these types of cottage village projects happening. But it's increasing in this case, going from a density use of 8 units to 30, which was allowed by the Planning Commission in this particular case, because it was fulfilling a very serious need for housing in the community. And it's a roughly $5 million project, to give you a sense of cost. And that's 30 units. Some are duplex units. Some of those larger they look like duplex units are actually family units, where so kind of to maintain some of the cohesion and the look and size of the dwellings. Some are combined as family units. So they have 2 bathrooms and 2 bedrooms. So they're very similar to the individual units, but that way families can use them, not just individuals or couples. And then you see there's various shared amenities between barbecue, community building, and laundry, covered areas for eating. It rains a lot here, and a community garden that will be managed by the public works from the tribe. And then there's future development. So we're only actually developing 2/3 of that 2-acre parcel, and the other 1/3 is being left as available space for future development for community, mostly for community assets, looking at behavioral health center, a future behavioral health center. And then kind of the last thing I wanted to talk about was, or I guess there's 2 more things, of kind of approaches to how we might re-envision the County of Hawaii Chapter 25, or have maybe addendums or amendments to it, and learning from what other cities, counties are doing in response to the increasing housing crisis. So here in Bellingham, and it's not that Bellingham is the only city, I'm just grabbing it because it's what we use locally, they have developed an infill toolkit since 2008, which allows a much more flexible, it allows the development of much more flexible housing typologies and use of the parcels. So this, looking at here, is one version is the cottage village model. So doing kind of an infill pocket, what's also often referred to as an infill pocket neighborhood. Granted, there's site area requirements and restraints. But this is something that would generally fit on a 1 to 2 acre lot. And then other options, again, this has to do with depending on where you are on the density gradient, idea of courtyard houses or courtyard developments. Otherwise, duplexes with potential detached units or ADUs that they share the same lot with. And so that's the toolkit that starts to, really change the policies and regulations within building, well, not necessarily the building code, but within the zoning code. And then I think the last part is really just education and like knowing what you can actually do. So with the question of ADUs, accessory dwelling units, being a forever unknown, there's been a lot of work recently. In this case, in Bellingham, they've developed the homeowner's handbook to building an ADU, which is a very clear handbook in kind of what your rights are to build an ADU, how you go about getting permitted, etc. I think the missing pieces are like how do you finance it, and whatnot. And again, it's not like Bellingham's the only city that's doing this. There's many other examples across the board. And of course, County of Hawaii and Hawaii overall, there's always, well, not always, because it still depends on your zone, but there's always the possibility of the ohana dwelling. And from what I hear, there's a lot of uncertainty on how you approach that topic as a possible development, where I think something similar to this, an educational guidebook for residents would be beneficial. So mahalo nui loa, open it for questions.
Quick question here. Thank you very much, Dr. Miller. Have you people with these projections also considered the CCRs that come with it, the conditions, covenants, and restrictions? For example, you go to Oahu, and I used to travel a lot in my business previously there. Two extreme examples: if you take Mililani, highly organized, well-constructed, you cannot even paint your house certain colors even, but you have a very well-organized place. Then you go you go down towards the coast, just past Kapolei, you have an area called Honokai Hale, and you just drive through that area, and it's a difficult situation. Realtors will tell you that. It's very difficult to sell a house in there because of the lack of, some people are a lot neater than others. And when you get into a community situation, once you're built, that's huge. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Byron, for the comment. I mean, yeah, the whole maintenance question and long-term care of the place is certainly a big question. And I didn't bring it up, but I think if we look at, again, like the cottage village developments, which the ones I've worked on typically fall in the PUD, so planned unit development realm, and they always have CCRs. CCRs become the laws to regulate more or less the maintenance of the development. And then as far as like the tiny home projects or like this, smaller cottage villages that are not independent parcels, everyone I've worked on is operated and maintained by a nonprofit organization, which is, so that does bring a concern in developing a lot like this, where you don't have oversight in the long-term maintenance. That certainly is an issue. And I don't have an answer for how to do it.
I just want to add that there's so many things, like layers of what we're trying to address when it comes to affordable housing. And especially for our Hawaiian communities and for our local, just Hawaii in general. So much generational trauma, so much that is being carried by on the shoulders of the people and the families and the youth. So yeah, wraparound services critical, and yeah, that oversight with nonprofit support as well as county support. So many partners need to come together because we are a community in recovery.
Yeah. Yeah, and to just give an example with the, all right, sorry, I can share it again. The Eagle Haven project that I mentioned. There's, I think 6 organizations that are all have come, they've created a, I don't know if it's a memorandum of agreement or what their kind of agreement contract is between them. You have behavioral health services, you have homelessness, or well, Loamy Stepping Stones, they deal with houselessness amongst Native American individuals. And then there's a larger nonprofit, Opportunity Council, which specifically works on low-income housing, as well as transitional housing programs throughout the region, all the way from Seattle up to here. And then there's a culturally based nonprofit that's leading the project. And I feel like there was, oh, well, then the tribe has agreed to managing maintenance and operate the facilities maintenance under their purview. So there's, yeah, I think to that point, it takes a village to support this small community.
I have a question. You mentioned that you've done most of these or all of these for nonprofits. So I guess ownership is not an issue, but in the private sector, have you given some thought to how title and land ownership would work with these essentially co-housing kind of developments?
Yeah, that's a good question. So like I mentioned, I have worked on the pocket neighborhood model, which is individual land parcels. So you would have title to your lot after the subdivision, and then have generally a CC&Rs, and there's an HOA as a component of it, at least the projects I've worked on. With these, where you're not doing a lot partition, you could imagine it falling under a condominium format. So you would have the ownership right of the interior walls, or the interior of the walls inward, but then probably an HOA that maintains the grounds. So I haven't researched enough to see what models are out there that use the condominium framework. That's a good question.
Can I follow up on that? Sorry. We're looking at 3 parcels that are privately owned. They're willing to put in workforce housing. We're focused on tiny homes to begin with, but the ownership in our mind would stay. It wouldn't transfer. It'll be making affordable rentals, so it'd be below market renting, but they would be working close to the working place. But so it's sort of like a hybrid of what Dennis is saying, what you're saying, but we want to keep it in the private side. Well, anyway, please address that.
So if it's managed by a company that would maintain ownership of the property and the buildings and then rent. So for example, the one project I worked on, tiny home project, ownership falls under the local housing authority. This is a county, it's in a county jurisdiction, so not in a municipality. And all the rent occurs through the, well, I don't know the framework well enough, but through the HUD federal requirements. That's probably not a great example because it's not private. But I'd imagine the private ownership would operate relatively similar. I mean, we have models of not necessarily tiny home developments, but small housing developments that often include apartment style homes, where it's all falls under one management company.
Hey guys, I'd love to jump in and just bring your attention to something. This is Chad Unrein with Mockingbird Tiny Homes. We have actually recently expanded to the mainland, and we chose Austin, Texas as our second location. Our first location's in Kealakekua on the Big Island. And you know, here there are a lot of different tiny home communities that have a lot of different options, from the nonprofit side to the private sector. And one of them to check out, I think that might be interesting to you, Byron, is Village Farm in Austin, Texas. And it's a pretty interesting community that's basically, there's 3 phases. The first 2 phases have been completed, and they are renting and selling basically RV lots. It really is what it is. It's a very nice community. Each lot, I think, is just under 2,000 square feet, which, you know, wouldn't work in Hawaii. We would definitely need to keep it 2,000 or more. But you know, it's interesting to see that they have a mix of rental lots and for sale lots where you can place your tiny home. And they also have a lot of community amenities that the HOA covers. So that's the one that I can think of that top of the head that comes to mind. Village Farm is in the private sector, and there's another one right next door that I can't remember the name of right now that actually is ran by a nonprofit, and that is for, you know, people that need housing immediately, not necessarily someone who's interested in buying a space to live in a tiny house. So hopefully that's somewhere you can go to get some information in the private sector.
You know, one of the problems we're having here is that I live in town, in Hilo town, and one time we were paying for a 3-bedroom house. We were renting for about 5 years. We're paying less than $1,500 a month. That was just 2 years ago. The same house is now going for over $2,500. You know, and so the rental trajectory has really, it's insane. And so, you know, having a rental market to handle the ALIS people is kind of what I'm looking to focus on, Dr. Miller. You're familiar with the ALIS group, so can your programs kind of target those kind of people? But we have a lot more of them than homeless, and a lot of people are struggling. And so, you know, if they can cut down the transportation costs, gas costs, you know, housing costs, that adds a lot more to the quality of life. And that's why we decided a housing component would be very good for us. Thank you.
Right. Yeah, I think, and that's, I guess my goal in a way is, how do you ensure, or how do you create more flexible regulations that allow for diverse options in housing typologies? Because right now they're very restrictive, and they're not, and you know, as we keep hearing in the news, the simple equation is that why are houses so expensive? Well, it's because the building industry collapsed in 2008 and didn't meet demand for 12 years. So now we have a massive deficit in housing supply. So how do we increase housing supply? Well, given our current models, we can't meet it that readily. outside of, high capital developments like high rises and giant apartment complexes. But even those tend not to pencil out, especially now when resources are escalating in price just as much as our rents are. And I think, I guess again, this is like an academic position, and I do look at how it's possible to implement, but like incremental construction, which is where tiny homes, not tiny homes as we know them now, allow for, but maybe modular construction allows for, is that we can build one unit, fits my family for now. But when I need to move my mom and my dad, then I need to expand. So when that happens, I can incrementally build out. Currently, that's very, very difficult, if not next to impossible to do, given our current building regulations. And I think that's another area. Again, this is like, how do you build flexible frameworks that maintain safety, health, and wellness, but allow for the needs of families while mitigating those cost burdens. Not an answer, just another, I guess, way of thinking of the problem.
Thank you so much, James, for this presentation. I just want to kind of see if we can start to move our conversation along. Are there any other final, I see Sue Leloy's hand up, so maybe that could be our final comment. And then James, would you be willing to, or we'll also share out your contact information for folks who have follow-up questions with you. It's very valuable. Thank you. Sue?
Hi, thanks. Thanks, Dr. Miller. I really honed in on some of the information that you provided related to lot sizes and our zoning and subdivision codes. I was just wondering if some of the innovative ideas that you had, if you had applied some variance options against what we know to be very hard corners in our zoning and our subdivision code. And I'm just asking because we all know that that's where a lot of the costs skyrocket, right? It's in the infrastructure costs. And so I was just wondering if through your research and study that you had utilized a variance process as a tool to limit and or mitigate some of those hard costs.
That's a very good question. I guess, my answer is try to avoid the variances because of the impacts on, well, both cost, well, not cost, well, cost of time more than anything, the impacts on schedules. And I guess often in that sense, it's trying to find the workarounds that make the project work within the, within the boundaries where we have, as opposed to applying for variances. As far as infrastructure, so the project I was showing where we were hard pressed against needing variances for mostly the water was too small. The main water pipe was only like a 4-inch water main. And then there was one really far away that was a 12-inch, but the cost to get to it was prohibitive. So what we ended up doing was working very closely with a pretty awesome civil engineer who's kind of he operates in the realm of net zero and living building challenge. So how do you have very, very low impact on the environment with development? And the civil team develops a water catchment system and treatment system at a fair, using pretty, I think, almost brand new technology that was surprisingly, we're not gonna say it's affordable, but compared to what we would have to have done, affordable. And it went over the top for the sustainability goals that were part of the project. So I think that's actually an area that is overlooked a lot, is what can you do for low impact development, from waste treatment, water catchment. Obviously we can do photovoltaics, solar energy, but there's so much you can do from that standpoint to mitigate the burden a development creates on the infrastructure system.
Thank you so much, folks, for the discussion. Sue, is there any follow-up?
No, I actually really like that he highlighted that, because that's actually where a lot of the costs are built in, right? Like to drag that water pipe, right, Dr. Miller, that you talked about, to get the 12-inch to the 4-inch. And if there's opportunities through cost savings with just smart engineering, where we could actually save water or get to that net zero, it might be a little bit more upfront, but in the end, it's actually cost savings. And the challenge, and I know the challenge for this entire group is sometimes just the house itself. You know, we don't have time. We're trying to look for other solutions, but we just really got to get something quick, like a modular unit or a factory built unit, or even some of the tiny home products, which I actually am very curious to talk about, and offline, Dr. Miller, how we can use our subdivision code to advance kind of tiny lot subdivision in our code, where we would put in the basic infrastructure, but you could actually get smaller lots, but they would lend itself to some of our tiny home products.
Yeah, and then you get to what Chad was mentioning.
Right. Yeah. Anyway, thank you, everyone. Thank you.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you guys so much for that rich discussion.